Hey all, so we are back with another Spotlight with Context, and I'm sure the thumbnail has already told y'all, this is probably going to be a long one. Not only is this one of my characters, which I tend to talk about for a little longer, this is also a relatively complex character. I know those go somewhat hand in hand, and a defender, so there is going to be quite a bit to talk about here. But let's get into the Serpent. For those of you not familiar, the Serpent is Odin's older brother, the god of fear. He is the main villain of the Fear Itself event, which is a pretty quick read if you're into comics. I think the main line is like 9 issues. It's pretty cool. He gives a bunch of characters like pseudo Mjolnir hammers, and he like ordains a bunch of different people his worthy. They lay waste to the earth, and then a bunch of the Avengers also get cool Uru outfits and fight back. It's a little bit campy, but it's a good time. I would recommend it. Anyway, with that in mind, he is the god of fear. He is spooky and very hard to kill. Let's talk about the base stats very briefly. He does not have the largest health pool in the game because if he did, he would probably be busted. As it is, he is just decently chunky, and we'll get into why he's hard to kill later. He also has quite good prestige. I believe this is just above Photon, putting him in the, as far as I can remember, top 5, 7 stars for prestige and top 10 for 6 stars. So, very worth investing in. I think the highest cosmic other than Silver Surfer. We move on to the attributes. Survivability 4.5. Like I said, this guy is just really, really hard to kill. There is higher than average base health, but we're also going to get into later just a ton of things that slow down damage. And I'm also going to call out, since we don't generally cover it in these spotlights, Serpent has both 15% crit resistance and higher than average armor. I think he's somewhere around 25%, which is going to slow incoming hits quite a bit. I've talked before a little bit about how strong defenders basically always have a certain amount of utility, for one, and then either damage or survivability, because defenders either need to credibly threaten to kill you before you can do anything, or they need to last long enough to get their threats online before you can kill them, right? So that's either damage or survivability. The Serpent is definitely more in the latter camp. The way fights often work against him is you're like, this isn't too bad, this isn't too bad, oh god, he's not done yet. And then you start getting scared. That's kind of the goal I was shooting for with God of Fear, so pretty happy with that. Damage 2.5, he is not a Battlegrounds nuke. He's definitely on the slower side there. There are some matchups where you could use him on offense and be pretty successful, but he is tuned offensively more around longer fights. There are definitely going to be places you can use him in war. He also has a few Necropolis fights where he does very well, including one that was showcased in the deep dive. So his damage can get very good, but you have to be fighting for long enough that the average damage is not exceptional. I will call that out. Ease of use 3, you can just hit the opponent and throw specials. That's pretty much all there is to it at its base, because he does gain a lot of power and let you do that. However, if you have played Massacre, Valkyrie, Hulkbuster, any of those characters where throwing specials into block benefits you in particular, those skills will transfer well to Serpent and will significantly spike his damage output if you can do it consistently. Utility of 3, a lot of it is the various immunities and resistances that make him a scarier defender, but there's also just a fair amount of utility built into this guy overall. A lot of it is also pretty automatic. You don't have to work for it too hard. So if you are in a fight where you can take your time and his damage isn't holding you back, he will definitely solve some problems for you. And then lastly, we've already talked about it a couple times already, 5 out of 5 defender. The Serpent is absolutely a problem. You need to have an answer, or he is probably just going to, like I said earlier, outlast you and then ramp enough that you lose. There are counters to him. There are no hard counters to him, right? There are some very good answers, but none of them solve all of his threats at the moment. So you're going to need to kind of figure out where the biggest pain points are and how you solve for them. I'll try and call out some of them as we go, but honestly, this is intended to be a bit of a puzzle, and so we'll kind of, as a community, figure it out as we go. Now, getting into strengths and weaknesses. I've already hinted at this, so it shouldn't be a surprise. The Serpent is very good at surviving damage. He has above average base armor rating. He mitigates critical hits and burst damage. This is the first person to do that. We'll get to that later. And his signature ability is a death immunity. It is, in my opinion, a fairly responsible death immunity, but he does have a sort of second life, and it is absolutely a threat. So, you have to figure out a way to kill him efficiently. He is very good at anti-miss and evade. He has true focus. He's the first champion to ship with that effect, and it can be permanent for the whole fight. So evading and missing is pretty difficult against him, and he can even punish it by doing damage after he gets ramped enough. Because he gets it on special attacks, and he starts with power gain, you can just kind of sit and wait to get this online, making the Serpent one of the best evade and miss counters in the game if you are willing to be a little bit patient. Additionally, as we just talked about, he does have a lot of access to power gain. If you play things right with him, you can throw very frequent special attacks, which is just generally good for controlling the fight. He is not Hyperion level, which I actually consider kind of a good thing. You won't go, oops, I have too much power. But you will usually find that you have a special when you need it. Weaknesses. Similarly, going the other way, frequent incoming special attacks are going to be a problem for him. He is a ramp character. He likes to build his resources over the course of the fight, and being knocked down by special attacks is the only way he can lose that resource. So this is definitely the single most important thing to focus on when trying to take him down, is the ability to throw frequent special attacks. Characters who can block unblockable specials are a bit of a problem as well. He can get around them, but they are going to slow him down quite a bit because his best damage rotation does require not just throwing specials into block, but specifically breaking block with specials, kind of like Hulkbuster. And then lastly, direct damage over time effects are a problem for him. The Serpent mitigates critical hits, he mitigates instant damaging effects, and he has access to physical and energy resist as the fight goes on. But actual damaging effects with a duration, like degen or poison, cut right through that and go directly to his health. Now, getting into the abilities, this first section is going to take a while to talk through, because this is the part of a defender that is honestly the least fun to design, because this is kind of the section that says no. This is the section that outlines all of the things that you can't do against him. It is necessary when building a 5 out of 5 defender, but it does make me a little bit sad as a designer, and so I'm sorry on the one hand, but on the other, I think it does end up creating kind of an interesting puzzle. And when you're using him as an attacker, you will very much appreciate all of these abilities to say no to your opponent. So, starting out, the Serpent has immunity to Power Lock, Special Lock, Heal Block, and Fate Seal, right? This is a very unique suite of immunities. We've seen all of these before, but I don't think in this combination, right? And this is one of the first cosmics. I think Galen is the only other one who is immune to Fate Seal. Now, I will call out, he is not immune to Nullify or Stagger. So you can deal with his buffs. You just can't do it by Fate Sealing all of them away at once. Additionally, Power Lock, Special Lock, Heal Block, just not going to work at all. And his ability power rate can be reduced by anyone. It doesn't have the full Atom treatment. But if you are not using a Mystic Champion, then the ability power rate can't be reduced below 50%. Now, this doesn't mean that the total reduction is locked at 50%, right? It just means that whatever the equation adds up to can't drop below 50%. So if he's on a node where he has 200% power gain, say, then a Science Champion could reduce that by 150 down to 50%. They just can't go lower. So if you're not using a Mystic, he will be gaining something from his power gain at all times. I will also call out here, because I know it's going to be a source of contention, yes, the word non-magnetic there does mean that he does not have the metal tag. I understand this is going to cause some upset. The other Asgardians do have the metal tag. He does not. I have a number of points here. I will try not to spend too long on it. First off, I honestly don't think the other Asgardians should have the metal tag. I think it should probably be a magnetic tag, and that they shouldn't have it. The fact that the Wakandans in the skill class are strong against Magneto, and the Asgardians in the cosmic class are weak to him, is very, very weird to me. Putting that aside, I think that from a lore perspective, the Serpent was literally sealed away before humanity existed. Like, he is older than humans themselves. I don't think it's that much of a lore stretch if Vibranium gets around Magneto, that his ancient armor also does. And then the last reason that I just want to cover this is, if you are angry that this, quote, locks out Magneto, I want you to consider that the things that we would have had to do to protect him from Magneto shutting him off would have inevitably made him a harder defender. I realize that that is a difficult counterfactual to really go through fully, but I promise you it would have been worse. In the long run, this is a player beneficial decision. I'm sure I'm going to get some comments that disagree, but that's my case. Moving on. The Serpent is immune to Cold Snap and reduces the duration of incoming bleed effects by 90%. So this is a percentage reduction. The flat bonus from Deep Wounds does get around this, so you can stack some bleeds on him. He is not immune to poison. You probably could use Archangel, I just wouldn't recommend it. It definitely makes him resistant to people whose primary source of damage is bleed, and it also just stops Cold Snap in its tracks. His combat power rate is reduced by 30%, but it cannot be reduced further. It can be increased by something like Energize or other nodes, right? And there's an effect later that does that. But it cannot be reduced below this now 70%, right? Now, it can be reduced back to that, right? If his combat power rate is increased and then decreased, it can come back to this. It just can't go further. I want to clarify that. He also reduces the potency of incoming power drain and power burn effects by 60%. They still affect him, but less. At the start of each fight, the Serpent gains a power gain buff, granting 25% of max power, so about 2/3 of a bar, over 8 seconds. When this buff ends or fails to activate, it goes on cooldown for 8 seconds, after which it triggers again. So you can nullify this buff away, you can stagger it, you can reduce the duration of it, you can neutralize it and prevent it from happening, right? But this cooldown will trigger when any of those things cause it to end or not activate in the first place. And so the buff is going to try and trigger more often if you prevent it. Just want to call that out because it will matter very soon in another part of the kit. As a defender, the Serpent inflicts a fear debuff for 10 seconds whenever the opponent activates an unblockable or unstoppable effect, unless fear is already active. So a reminder, because this is a new effect only found on White Tiger before this, fear reduces unblockable ability accuracy by 100% and also prevents the opponent from perfect blocking. Now, this will not prevent the unblockable effect that triggered it, right? So don't think that you can just block Hulkling with impunity and prevent his incoming unblockable. This just means that if you're dealing with an opponent that has multiple unblockable abilities, that once the first one triggers, you have some insurance against the next. This also means that a defending Serpent is probably going to mess up the rotation of an attacker that relies on unblockable or unstoppable or some combination of them. So keep an eye out for that. Now, Dread. The Serpent does have a persistent charge. He starts each quest with 1. Winning a fight grants him another Dread. And as a defender, he starts with 3. I do want to clarify, he only starts with 3 the first fight. This is not something that's going to reset to 3 every time you fight him if you end up losing. But you are going to have to deal with max Dread for that first fight at least. At the start of each fight, gain an indefinite Fury buff, increasing attack rating by a certain amount for each Dread. So it's only ever 1 buff, but the more Dread you have, the stronger that Fury is. Also for each Dread, the opponent's critical penetration and the potency of incoming instant damaging effects from champions are both reduced by 20%. So this is relatively rare language. Let's go over it. Critical penetration is something you may remember from Absorbing Man. This is the amount of armor and resistance that critical hits ignore. So the base value is 80%. Normally, critical hits ignore 80% of armor and resistances. The Serpent is going to drop that number by 20% flat for each Dread, meaning that a Serpent with 3 Dread reduces that 80 down to 20. Incoming critical hits are only going to ignore 20% of armor and resistances. You cannot just rely on your crits to get him down. And then instant damage is a new ability that we have to differentiate between passives with a duration and passives with duration 0. Some of y'all asked during the Absorbing Man Winter of Woe fight why burst damage was covered by that immune to damage over time node, right? And that's because not too long ago, we didn't have the ability to differentiate, right? An instant bleed and a passive bleed that lasts 5 seconds are both under the hood passive bleeds. We didn't have a way to tell the difference between them, even though we can clearly say, well, one is instant and one isn't, right? Now we can do that, and the Serpent does. So he doesn't do anything to stop damaging over time effects with a duration, whether they're debuffs or passives. But any kind of burst damage, instant bleed, instant shock is going to get blunted by up to 60% depending on his Dread. This is going to dramatically slow down certain attackers like Tigra, Absorbing Man, Spidey Supreme, right? Moving on to Culforce Charges. Dread is what ramps the Serpent over a quest. Culforce Charges are what ramps him within a single fight. So he gains 1 charge when 1 or more personal buffs end or are prevented by ability accuracy or immunity. I need to call out end here. Does not care how the buff ends. This refers to a buff being replaced by a new one. If it's non-stacking, there are a couple buffs in here for which that could apply. This works if the buff expires naturally, if it has a duration. This triggers if it is neutralized, because note the prevented by ability, accuracy, or immunity. This will trigger if Claire's buff immunity prevents the buff. This will trigger if something is removed by Venompool's Omnom. Basically, if the buff tries to trigger, whether it succeeds or not, there's probably going to be a charge eventually, right? This is why I made a deal earlier about the power gain coming back sooner if you prevent it or get rid of it. Because if you use somebody who nullifies away that power gain, that is a valid strategy, but you have to weigh that against the fact that you are probably causing Serpent to ramp more quickly, right? Because if you stagger away every power gain, then he's trying to gain a power gain every 8 seconds. As opposed to if you let that power gain run its course, then a power gain is only ending every 16 seconds, spreading out this particular source of charge gain. Now, sometimes removing or preventing his buffs is absolutely the correct call, so I'm not saying don't do it, but it is something that you have to be a little intentional about. He also gains a charge when his power is drained or burned. I expect this to be more of an offensive trigger. You're probably not going to be trying to fight him with the kinds of tech champs that have these abilities, but if you were thinking about it, don't. This will only trigger every 2 seconds, though. It's not something that's going to spam like Gallon Sick. He also gains a charge the first time during each of his special attacks that the opponent dodges back. This basically means that you can avoid this charge if you set yourself up to be able to block all of his special attacks and never dodge back during them. But if you dodge once, twice, 3 times, whatever, if you dodge backwards at all during the specials, he's going to gain a charge. So something to keep in mind there. And then also +1 charge per bar of power spent when the opponent is knocked down by a special attack, and another if they are knocked into the wall. So this means that, assuming you are knocking them into the wall, Special 1 grants 2, Special 2 grants 3, Special 3 grants 4. And then the one way he can lose charges, and therefore very important when he is defending, -1 charge when the Serpent himself is knocked down by a special attack, and another if knocked into the wall. So you really want to keep him at the wall and be knocking him down with special attacks to control his Culforce Charges. The reason you care about Culforce Charges is this next section. At 4 charges or more, he gains an indefinite resistance up passive. This isn't huge. If I remember correctly, against an equal opponent, it's about 30%, but that is going to slow down any kind of damage over time abilities that deal physical or energy damage. And so that is potentially a problem. If you're trying to use those characters, you're going to want to keep this off if you can. At 8 charges or more, he gains a Pierce passive. This is not as large as Hulkling's Pierces, but it is going to hurt. And while active, attacks that strike the opponent or their block while their back is to the wall deal a burst of energy damage equal to 10% of attack rating. So this probably is not coming up on defense unless you are already losing badly, right? It will sometimes, but for the most part, you're not going to want to let him back you up. So this is, in my opinion, more an attacking tool. You are wanting to hit the opponent a lot when their back is to the wall, including into block. Really take advantage of that Pierce passive. At 12 charges or more, any attacks that cause evade or miss to fail deal a burst of direct damage, and striking the opponent's block pauses personal power gains and furies for 0.35 seconds. So that is a very short pause, but it does mean that if you have your power gain active, you can hit into the opponent's block for a full combo, do some of your pierce damage if you have them backed up against the wall, and just hold on to your power gain for the duration of that combo before finally throwing your special attack. We'll get to why it's safe to throw special attacks into block in a minute. Whenever the Serpent gains a charge, he also gains a 40% inexorable passive for 3 seconds, plus an additional 0.3 seconds per charge. This effect does not trigger if already active, and is removed when struck by a special attack. So let's go through that, because inexorable is a new effect, right? What inexorable means is that you cannot be knocked back by basic attacks. This is not unstoppable. You will react to the incoming hits. This does not mean that the Serpent can just hit you in response if you're hitting into him, right? But it does mean he won't move on the map. Think of it as similar to Vox's Never Back Down passive, except instead of it kicking in when Vox is dashing backwards, it kicks in when the Serpent himself is being hit. Again, it's only by basics, so if you're throwing specials, you can get around this. Now, part of the reason you care about this is, remember, some of his abilities care about him having you against the wall, and you don't want to get backed up. The other reason you care about this is that 40% part refers to the potency of Inexorable, which is how much his defensive combat power rate is increased while this is active. So when you're striking him with a basic attack, while he's inexorable, he will be gaining 40% more combat power, which is going to add up very quickly. Because remember, his combat power rate is reduced by 30%, but this will overcome that, and he will be gaining more power than someone else. Couple that with his power gain, you start to have a problem. So you're going to want to either avoid hitting him too much while this is active, or, like I said, have a special ready to remove it. This is also another reason to try and keep him from ramping, because remember, if he has up to 16 charges, which is how high they stack, then that 0.3 seconds really starts to add up, and you're looking at around 8 seconds total for this effect. That is probably not something you're going to be able to wait out all that well. Now, once the Serpent gets to max charges, which is hopefully something that only happens on offense, whenever he would gain 1 or more charges, he instead gains a Fury passive. This is a relatively small Fury passive. If I remember correctly, these are about 20% of base, but they last for a long time. They last for 60 seconds, and you can get up to 20 of them. Because these are personal Furies, they will also pause when you're hitting into the opponent's block. So think of this as kind of similar to Venom Pool, right? You are gaining abilities as you're ramping, and then once you're ramped, any further ramp just is turned into pure damage. I also want to call out the 1 or more language. Remember that when the Serpent knocks down an opponent with a special, he can gain up to 4 charges at once, but that is still going to just give 1 Fury. Now, moving on to his special attacks, I'm going to say it before we even start. Roll with me here, and I'll explain why this isn't as bad as it looks. So, on activation, the Serpent gains an unblockable passive for 0.65 seconds. If the first hit breaks the opponent's block, the unblockable is paused, and as an attacker, the potency of the Serpent's instant damage is increased by 70% until the end of the special attack. So remember, instant damage refers to any damage without a duration attached. This boost in that instant damage only happens for an attacker. The unblockable and the unblockable pausing will happen as a defender if you're unlucky enough to be hit by them, but the damage increase only happens for an attacker. Also on activation, the Serpent gains an indefinite True Focus buff. This buff is removed when the Serpent is struck, but as a defender only when struck by a special attack. And while this buff is active, the Serpent's special attacks cannot be avoided with the Dexterity Mastery. Now, you can stagger away this True Focus buff and prevent it, but I know that immediately the question is going to be, what the heck, DLL? Why does this guy have unblockable, undexable specials? I thought you did this already, and these don't look like you can avoid them. But you can. You can avoid these with any character in the game. Because the first hit of the Serpent special attacks is a hammer hit, is a melee hit. And melee hits in our game can always be avoided by dodging backwards with or without dexterity. The window is a little bit tighter than dexterity, don't get me wrong, so I'm not saying this isn't tricky. But you can learn how to do this and bait his specials proactively, kind of like you would for somebody like Electro or Yellow Jacket, and you can avoid the unblockable and then block the rest of the special. And that is the goal here, right? Now, avoiding the unblockable does mean you're dashing back during his specials, which is going to give him a charge. I'm not going to hide that. And that does mean that Mystics who can block unblockable do better against him. But this is not the "you are definitely going to get hit" ability that I know it reads as. You can dex the specials if you can prevent or remove the true focus buff. Neutralize also works here. But you don't have to. You can literally use anyone in the game and not eat this whole special by learning to get away from that first hit. You can also outrange it if he throws it from far enough away, but I'm saying even if he is right next to you, you can avoid the unblockable hit and block the rest. Try that a few times before you form your final opinion on this. Now, backing up to the Serpent as an attacker, I want to call out that this is the Hulkbuster section, right? You only get that damage boost if the unblockable hit, that first hit, breaks the opponent's block. It can't just land, it has to break their block. So you want to either combo into them and then throw this while they're blocking, or you want to do one of those tricks that you use for Hulkbuster, Massacre Valkyrie, where you either finish your combo, pause for a second, and then throw it, hoping that they block, or you dash backwards after not finishing your combo. You do like medium, light, 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 dash back and immediately throw it, and I find this pretty reliably gets them to block, allowing you to break their block and then deal damage. I tested this extensively. Both the Serpent Special 1 and Special 2 will make contact even if you dash back and throw it like this, right? As long as the opponent blocks, they will still be close enough that you will break their block. Now, moving on to the Special 1, things are starting to get a little simpler. On activation, inflict a fear debuff for 10 seconds unless already active. So this is going to make it harder for your opponent to get any unblockable abilities online. Pretty helpful. And projectile hits here. Inflict an instant cold snap. This will scale with the Dread Fury and with all of the Furies from hitting max charges. This is also an instant effect, and so will be boosted by 70% after all of those attack increases, as long as you break block with this special. This is probably going to be your bread and butter for a lot of fights, because once you get your opponent into the corner, this is going to generate 2 charges every time you knock them down. That's pretty darn good. The Special 2 projectile hits here deal a larger burst of direct damage, which is multiplied by 250% of the opponent's armor rating. Now, the reason this is laid out this way is to let you know that if the opponent's armor rating is 0 or lower, such as against somebody like Man-Thing, who has no natural armor, then this will actually do 0 damage, because it will be the Serpent's attack multiplied by 0. So you do have to pay attention to that. There are some opponents against which this is actually a bad idea. If the node that you are using is putting armor breaks on the opponent, I would also avoid this. But the flip side of that is that if you're facing somebody with a lot of armor, then this can do an absolute ton of damage. So just understand both ends of that, right? At the end of this attack, gain a power gain buff, granting 15% of max power over 5 seconds. So this gives you a bit of a refund, brings you back closer to the special 1. The special 2 is decently efficient at generating charges, because remember, if you have the opponent with their back to the wall, then this will give you 3 right away, plus another one when this power gain ends. So the special 1 gives you 2 charges for 1 bar. This gives you up to 4 charges for 2 bars, and gets you close to another special 1. I think it is generally simpler to just spam the special 1 in a lot of fights, but going special 2, special 1, special 2, special 1 can be pretty viable as well. Moving on to the special 3, you gain a non-stacking Hour of the Allfather passive, which doubles all charge and personal fury gains for 40 seconds. So remember, with the furies, you only get 1 at a time, no matter how many charges you gain, but this is going to make that 2 at a time, no matter how many charges you gain, and then all of your charge gains will also double. The special 3 is generally something I would only throw in longer fights so that you can get to 16 a lot quicker, but it is good at that. If the fury buff from Dread is not active, then this will reapply it, so you can get it back. That was one thing that felt kind of important to me, similar to with Odin. But also, if there is an aptitude or an intensify active, such as from the Thor relic, you can improve it by reapplying it, throwing this special. Nice little bonus there. And if this attack deals 0 damage, gain a power gain buff, granting 2 bars of power over 1 second. So if this is thrown into some kind of indestructible or invulnerability effect, or even just 100% protection, the Serpent gets a refund. I'm not saying you can't use invulnerability boosts against him, but it definitely does not take all of the threat out of it. Now, moving on to his SIG, here's another reason to care about both Culforce Charges and where you are on the map. Each Culforce Charge grants up to a certain amount of attack rating, scaling with how close the opponent is to the wall. So you will get this full benefit when the opponent's back is to the wall, and if you, the Serpent, are backed up to your wall, you will get almost nothing from this. I won't say fully nothing, because it's based on the opponent's position, and it is impossible for the opponent to be at the Serpent's wall, but it will be almost nothing if the Serpent is fully backed up. So keep that in mind on defense against a duped Serpent. He also gains immunity to stun effects during the opponent's special attacks. He's not stun immune overall, right? But specials that stun specifically are not going to be very helpful against him. And then here's the death immunity, right? Let's take our time going through this, because it at least reads complex. But it's somewhat similar to Mephisto. I'll call that out now, if that helps you contextualize it. Once per fight, when the Serpent would be knocked out, he has a 125% chance to consume all Dread to gain a death immunity buff for 8 seconds. So that 125 chance means that this can be prevented with something like Danny's Marked passive or with Neutralize. It's just that if it's only a 100% reduction, there is a chance that this gets through, right? This buff cannot be staggered or nullified. It is just immune to those effects, very similar to how Iron Man's armor-ups work. Reminder, he is Fate Seal immune, so that basically means that your options are prevented in the first place with Neutralize or some other ability accuracy reduction, or reduce its duration with somebody like Mojo or Kindred. And then for each Dread consumed, over that 8 seconds, this buff recovers health and grants power per second. So Off the top of my head, it's been a little bit. I believe this heals about 30% of max health before accounting for recovery. And it gives you just under 2 bars of power. So if you are about to knock out the Serpent above a bar of power, it is possible for this to send him red. But it is also possible to play around this, make sure he's below a bar of power, and to know that you have a little bit more time to deal with this. This is a significant threat, right? It means that unless you are reducing the duration of or preventing this death immunity buff, you are almost definitely going to have to deal with some more specials right at the end of the fight when he is at his most dangerous. But it's not supposed to be an instant special 3, right? It is not White Tiger, it is not Destroyer. You can play around it. You also can just reduce his ability power rate and try and get around it that way. He is also, while he is immune to heal block, so techs are probably not going to be able to deal with this regen, he's not immune to regen rate modification. So poison, despair, anything else are valid options for shutting down that part of this buff. And like we talked about, he consumes all dread to do this. So if he goes nuts and knocks out an attacker on defense by doing this, then that means he will, quote, win a fight. He'll get 1 dread back, and then when you come back in to fight him, he's going to be a lot easier, right? This also means that if you are playing as the Serpent, once you use this, that dread is used up, and you have to win a fight before you get the benefit again. That's why I kind of compared it to Mephisto. This is not an infinite second life thing. This is not Heimdall. This is not Hercules. But it is very powerful, and it absolutely can be used multiple times in a quest. So, moving on to synergies. We have a couple pretty simple ones. Hammer Time with Thor, Jane Foster, Cull Obsidian, and Iron Man Infinity War. Any hammer attacks gain 20% attack rating. For those of you curious, hammer attacks are the vast majority of Cull Obsidian's moveset. This is a very good synergy for him. Polearm Pals with Vox, Terrax, Gallon, Jabari Panther, and Mr. Negative. Striking the opponent while their back is against the wall grants a cruelty buff for 6 seconds, which does not reapply if active. This has some really interesting benefits for a few of these characters. For somebody like Jabari, this is just more damage, right? For Vox, when this expires, it will be converted into a permanent cruelty and is much stronger than the ones he gains from his own kit. For Terrax, this allows him to land bigger guaranteed crits while he's in Rockfield. For Gallon, this is another buff that will feed that. And for Mr. Negative, again, this is another buff, which he can then convert into light energy. So I really like this synergy for all of them. Plus, just landing bigger yellow numbers is sometimes good too. Minister of Justice with both the Destroyer and Odin. While the opponent is below 25% of their max health, gain a 20% Flourish passive. As a reminder, Flourish increases both ability power and combat power rate. So this will benefit the Destroyer's power gains. It will also just increase how much power all 3 of these characters get from hitting their opponent. Finally, the main event. I know a lot of people were expecting a nod like this. We have added the Cullsworthy tag to the game. So all of the characters that we currently have in the game that the Serpent gave hammers to during Fear itself now share a tag. That is Absorbing Man, Titania, Atuma, Hulk, Juggernaut, and Thing. If we ever add Grey Gargoyle or Scotty, Sin in the future, they'll probably get it as well, right? This synergy only turns on with Absorbing Man, Titania, and Atuma. I didn't want to build a synergy that could potentially have 8 members in the long run, so I just picked 3, and you turn it on with them, but it will benefit any tagged champion as long as they are on the team. So any Culls-worthy character will increase the potency of their instant damaging effects by 15%. Funnily enough, every person with that tag other than Thing has instant damaging effects. So this works out quite nicely. And then the Serpent himself, his personal Fury effects are 8% more potent for each tagged champion on the team. This means that if you bring a full team of his worthy, his Furies will be almost a third stronger. And then that is the Serpent. I knew this was going to be a longer one. I think that his abilities really deserve some focus both on offense and on defense. And I wanted to explain some of these so that you understood why they're not as mean as they read on first look. But this is definitely a dangerous defender. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. I don't want this particular video to turn into a discussion of the overall cadence of defender strength. We can talk about that in streams. It is something we're looking at, right? We very much consider this a high watermark. We know that November through January was too much too quickly. We're going to fix that. But I promise you, this is not just us ignoring that problem. The Serpent has been locked pretty much in this state for months now. That is just how our timeline works out. He was always going to be a defender. And come on, he's the god of fear. It was kind of inevitable. But I hope you guys do enjoy the puzzle that he is on defense, enjoy using him on offense, and ultimately agree with me that he's a pretty cool addition to this game. I didn't know a ton about this character when I started working on him. I had read Fear itself, but then I dug into him more, and I have become extremely fond of my silly, over-the-top Disney villain. He's so great. I'm really proud of this one, and I hope you guys enjoy it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I will see you soon. Until next time, thanks so much for watching, and take care.